take a few moments to be silent before God and just think, how do I define me?
Who am I? What are the words that you use to describe yourself? Labels. This as a person who, my dad is a born again man, and he's changed. God has changed his life. But there was a short period of time in my life when he was not following Christ, and he used labels of me, which go down deep inside, and then they come back. Things like stupid and lazy, and it's easy to, when you're living sometimes with discouragement in the flesh, that sometimes you slip into those kinds of ideas. What do you do? What do you define yourself with? What are the labels that you use when you're by yourself, when you're struggling with discouragement, and when someone comes along and gives you disrespect? One of the things that you can do is a little temperature gauge for yourself is, how do you react when you have disrespect handed to you? When things are really good and things are going really awesome and everything seems to be right with the world, sometimes when people give you disrespect, you handle it okay. Sometimes you don't. But sometimes when you handle it badly, those are those times when you need to look at, okay, why did this bother me so much? I remember hearing a story just recently of a man who was a model employee at his factory. It's a union shop. Everybody loved him, both his foreman and management and everybody who was involved in the upper parts of the running the factory, and his coworkers loved him. And then all of a sudden, now comes time for a contract, and there's talk of the talks breaking down, and there's issues, and he's constantly providing a mediating voice, and he's saying to his union brothers, come on, let's just calm down a little bit, everything's going to be okay, and he's constantly trying to be that voice of calm and reassurance. And then to the management, he's saying, we want to work here. We know you appreciate us and our labor and things like that. And we want to continue to make this company a great company. Well, then one day the word comes that the talks have absolutely broken down. And they're openly saying, we're just going to fire all you guys and we're going to bring in a bunch of replacement workers. And that does something to him. He becomes extremely angry. And now he's one of the guys who's at the forefront of the line and with the signs saying, hey, no disrespect, and this is not the way you're going to treat us, and running the rallies and being a big part of the rah-rah team for making sure that everybody stays rallied up in the union and fighting the management. And someone asked him, what changed? What changed in you? What happened to you that this happened, that now you're not this, pro-company person? And he said, the fact that they decided to do this, and they've been telling me for years that I was valuable and I was worthwhile, and all of a sudden when they said they could just fire me, it just said that all that stuff is a lie. And I felt disrespected. Disrespect. How do we handle that when it comes our way? How do we handle it when we're driving down the road and we're going 75 miles an hour, and all of a sudden someone comes along and passes and cuts us off, right? Just right there, just whoom, right in front of us, right? And that person disrespected me. Little do you realize that he was on a phone and just not paying attention. But suddenly this has become all about you and him, right? And then, you just kind of get that bumper right up behind him to tuck it up nice and close, just to send him a message. He goes, you're not going to disrespect me. I know none of you have ever done anything like that here in this room. My own son had to get after me one time. Don't get up behind that guy, Dad. He disrespected me, right? I think we've all experienced some things like that at times, whether it's happening in a grocery store, we think someone has disrespected us, and people have this thing, right, to talk about how, that's short for disrespect. You disrespect me. And we see sometimes the effects of this kind of disrespect with people getting shot in their cars or drive-by shootings. Obviously this is something that really tugs on deep strings within us, doesn't it? Today we're going to talk about a guy who experienced precisely that sort of thing. We just read about it. This fellow named Haman. who had been just going about his business, doing his thing. Everything's right with the world. Everything feels good. And all of a sudden, one guy just becomes the fly in his ointment. And so we're going to turn back to the book of Esther, and we're going to revisit these two individuals. And let's talk about who Haman is, and let's go to chapter 5. Chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 9 to 13. And what's happened here at this point, now the story has progressed. I'm sure most of you are probably very familiar with the details of this. But just to kind of review, Haman's had his luncheon with the queen and the king, and has actually been invited back for a second one. And so for every reason on earth, he ought to be on the top of the world right now. He's one of the top guys in the top most powerful country in the entire planet, right? And so he steps out of this luncheon that he's got with Esther, and he sees this guy again, and this guy doesn't give him any respect. Doesn't bow down, doesn't fall on his face like he's supposed to, right? And he goes home, and he's in a rage. Verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. See, hey, I'm on top of the world. Everything's great. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Just put yourself again in that car when someone cuts you off, right? I would never get that upset about anything. Yeah, well, let's see how you drive on the freeway sometime when that happens, all right? I'll bet you've had those times. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, I'm going to come back to that. Notice his wife is named and is called with his friends, his fellow counselors. Okay? Notice that. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I am the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. So let's think about who Haman is here for just a moment. Some people have suggested the idea that he might be the number 2 man in this entire country, and that's the vizier. Okay, he's kind of the guy who's in charge of running the government on a day-to-day basis. But others suggest, and I think this is the better idea, there was this particular position high up in the Persian government. It was called the King's Eye. And it's kind of his job to go around and take a look, okay, who's being loyal and who's not? Can you imagine the opportunities for graft in that sort of job? And that kind of fits with what we see him doing early on in this book when he kind of says, there's this people, they have different customs, and they don't respect the king. They're just not trustworthy. Okay, you need to be frightened of him, king. We need to get rid of him. So I think that's kind of what he is. He's kind of like a spy master, right? And so his job is to see who's going to be loyal, and so he suggests, and the king just says, okay, yep, that's your job, so we'll just go ahead and just do whatever you need to do to get rid of these people, right? He has good and wise friends. He's constantly summoning his friends to be a part of his council. And he talks to them, he says, here's what's going on, let me hear your ideas. And later on in chapter 6, verse 13, it refers to them as being his advisors or counselors. The word is hakam. They're wise men. These are people who are known to be skillful at living life and have all those proverbs and ideas so that they can make good decisions and wise choices and guide other people. And these are his friends. So he surrounds himself with really good people. I think that most of us who are probably sitting here would think this Haman was actually a pretty good guy. One of the things you ladies, I want you to understand is he honored his wife. He thought his wife was the stuff, so that she even was a part of his circle of counselors. He honored his wife and loved her. So, you guys are sitting out there and you're just kind of going, wait, Pastor Mike, you're meddling here a little bit. No, you guys, gals, he loved his wife and he treated her with dignity and respect. So there's a lot of things about this guy that we should like. If I had a guy like this, I would definitely like him in my circle. He had money. he had a tremendous amount of money. He was an extremely wealthy man. Is so wealthy that he was willing to donate 10,000 talents of silver to the treasury. That's 330 tons of silver. He was willing to donate to the treasury to cover the cost of killing all these Jews. In order for you to understand how much value that has, you can't calculate it based on the current value of silver. Even then, it's in the several millions, all right? But don't calculate based on that, because silver's kind of not as worth as much as it has been historically. Think about it this way. At the golden age of Athens, when it was at the height of its power, about 100 years after these events, in their treasury they had 10,000 talents of silver. So the entire net worth of a major city-state in that day and age. Okay? Here's another way you can measure this. Remember, this is the largest empire on the planet that goes all the way across Greece, down to Egypt, and all the way across over to India. The entire national revenue for 1 year was 10,000 talents of silver. That's how much they took in taxation and revenue and tithes from the entire nation. So this is a huge, huge amount of money. So obviously, he's tremendously wealthy. He also had a big family. He's got 10 sons. And like I said, a great relationship with his wife, Zeresh. And he had power. Because he had the ear of the king, the trust of the man who was the head of the biggest nation on the planet. In other words, Haman seemed to have everything that this world tells us should make a person happy. So now here it comes. We're talking about labels again, right? And you thought about the labels that you used to think about yourself in those times when whether you're feeling good or feeling bad. Some of us use terms that are defined by power, like titles. You know, I have to admit I enjoy talking to Gary about academia. And we had this discussion the other day about full professors and associate professors and assistant professors. And I have to admit I felt myself going, I'm full professor, Pastor Mike McDonald, right? You know, and I have this running joke I put on the bulletin or the registration. I say, Right Reverend Your Holiness on there. And you know, those kinds of fun things. And I have to admit there's a part of me that it appeals to, the idea of having titles and all those sorts of things. I had a professor in college, or seminary actually. His name was H. Wayne House. And he had 9 academic degrees. So he was doctor this and doctor that. And he had several PhDs. He had a JD, Doctor of Jurisprudence. He was a lawyer. And I was just like, wow, you know, that'd be me. I'd love to have that, right? You know, titles. And we all probably have at one time or another thought about those kinds of things and maybe had a title or two that was very important to us, and we use that to define ourselves. Sometimes we define ourselves by power with how many people I can push around. You know, sometimes, unfortunately, people go into ministry because they think that they get up to stand up in front and yell at people all the time, right? You know, that's ministry. You know, when ministry is mostly here. You know, that's why we talk about, you know, we have one mouth and 2 ears, right? We need to listen in ministry. But sometimes people think of that as, how many people can I push around? And the size of the number of people I have on my staff. And, you know, well, how is it that you have more people on your staff than I have on my staff? You know, people get into those kinds of games that way. How about this one? Sometimes people define themselves by their wealth. Or by any accumulated thing, for that matter. You know, look at the size of my ball card collection. Look at the size of my car collection. You know, just the accumulations. And I see myself through the lens of this thing I've accumulated. Money. How many bank accounts? Who am I invested with? Well, I'm invested with Waddell and Reed. Well, I've got holdings with Edward Robinson. You know, and who's got the better, you know, investment strategy? You know, churches can do that too, you know. Just not long ago, I was talking to John Walworth. He's doing much better, by the way, for those of you who know him. But he was telling me that there was a church up in Saginaw that had a part-time pastor, 25 hours a week. And the church was continuing to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And they fired this pastor. Said, the reason why we're having this problem is this is all your fault. Now, the interesting thing is, that church had $1 million in financial holdings. Can you imagine all the ministry they could have been doing with that money? You think they could have afforded a full-time pastor with that? Yeah, I think they probably could have. But this is the way this church saw itself, is we are a holder of assets to keep the church doors open. And if we happen to have a staff person along that builds things up, great. They had wrongly defined themselves. Sometimes we define ourselves by our associations. Hammond did this. I'm associated with the king, and I'm associated with these friends, and I'm associated with Queen Esther. She's my buddy, and we just hung out and talked all the time at this dinner. You know, people do that. They define themselves as with the clubs that they're a part of, or they define themselves about who's on their phone. You know, you're scrolling through the phone, you're with that person, you're saying, oh, yeah, here's our congressman. Oh, that's the judge. You know, you've been around people like that? I have. We define ourselves sometimes by what we do. A lot of guys do this. You know, what's the second thing you ask a guy? If you're with guys, what do you do for a living? Right? And see, the problem with defining ourselves by what we do is we're making ourselves out to be human doings rather than human beings, right? What happens when what we do to define ourselves with suddenly is taken away? You lose your job, fired, you're downsized, you retire. And because that person had defined themselves based on their job, suddenly they've lost their view of who they really are. Sometimes we define ourselves by what other human beings simply think of us or say of us. When public opinion is good, then you're feeling good. And when it's bad, you're feeling bad. You know, how many people are disintegrated by what they read sometimes on Facebook when it's directed at themselves? We were having a conversation just this morning about letters to the editor in the paper. You know, and when you're a politician, you have to have a sense of self-esteem that you can't be defined by what people say about you, because you got to be above that, because people are just going to be ugly towards you. It's the way it is. What we see here with Haman is he defined himself through all of these vehicles, through all of these lenses. And the interesting thing is, even he, as he assesses the situation, can't comprehend why he's having a problem with Mordecai. Look at what he says. He says right here, verse 13, all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Even he himself knows that he ought to be happy and excited, and this ought not to be bothering him. But it does. And the fact that it's bothering him is that guy's fault. It's that guy's fault. Doing character studies like we have been affords us the opportunity to be able to do compare and contrast. And so let's compare him and contrast him with some other Bible figures. When they were slighted, how did they deal with it? Israel's first king was a fellow named Saul. And I love to study Saul. I've revisited him time and time again because one of the last things I want to do is be like that guy. You know, he started out really great, and then pretty soon it went south. And there's lots of times and things I can see inside myself where I could be like Saul. Saul started out humble man. He was chosen by God, and he's picked also by the people of Israel, but he was chosen primarily first by God. And he's a humble man, chosen from humble means, and he starts to be king, and he's successful. Does some really good stuff. But then after he does the first few good things, all of a sudden he starts to kind of get a picture of himself, and that isn't so good. At one point, he sets up a monument to himself. And then Samuel comes along. He's the guy who is used by God to install Saul as king. He comes up, and he says to Saul, I need you to do such and so, and do this all right in just this kind of a way, and then you can go on and continue to be king. So Saul starts to do such and so, but didn't do it in such and such a kind of a way, and then all of a sudden he's got a huge mess on his hands, and Samuel comes up to him and says, you didn't do it right. You know, when you were a humble man, God made you king, but now look at yourself. You're just full of yourself. You think you're all that. God's taken away the kingdom away from you and given it to someone else. And he turns and he's going to walk away. Now, a person with a healthy, right self-image in light of God ought to have said, you know, he's right. Samuel, I'm sorry. I've done wrong, and when you've got the guy and he's ready to go, I'll hand him my crown. That's what he ought to have done. But instead, he's threatened because now he's identified himself by the label of king, and he loves kingship, and he loves the privileges. And so what does he do? He reaches out and he seizes Samuel by the robe and then tries to jerk him around, and the robe tears. And God says, as you've torn my robe, so God has torn the kingdom away from you. The upshot is that what happens now to Saul is now he becomes so out of control that he ends up trying to kill people. And he kills a lot of people to keep his crown. David himself, as we talked about last week, as he's dealing with this man named Nabal. He's out there in the wilderness. He's lost his home. He's lost his first wife. He's away from his parents. And all the people he thought really loved and adored him now hate him. His own father-in-law is trying to kill him. So he's kind of shut out into the wilderness, and he's out there and he's doing his thing, and he's trying to be good to people. And someone responds back to this idea that he's being good to people with, David, you're nothing more than a runaway slave. Think about that for a label on yourself. And so to that disrespect, David responds with, I'm going to kill him. Now, thankfully, as we know, and we talked about last week, David is headed off on his way to go and kill this man. But let's compare him, let's contrast him actually to himself later in his life. David, later in his life, is being attacked by his own son, Absalom. David has to flee the city of Jerusalem. And as he's fleeing the city of Jerusalem, what happens? Along comes this guy named Shimei. He's a relative of Saul, actually. And Shimei comes out and starts throwing rocks at David. You bloody murderous man, look what's happening to you. Ha, 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 ha. You're on the way out of town because you're a murderer and you killed your own king. You're getting what you deserve. How does he handle it? He handles it by saying, maybe God is using this guy. Maybe God is telling him to say some things to me to rebuke me. And as long as he's going ahead and he thinks he's doing God's will, I'm just going to let him, and I'll let God sort all that out. See the difference? He's gone from I have to take matters into my own hand and vengeance in my own hand to let God sort that out. Huge growth. He's learned how to see himself rightly before his God. Moses, when people came after him, he left it to God. Paul, when people came after him, he defined himself by Christ He said, as my Christ suffered, then I also have to suffer. And Peter tells us that when we are mistreated, we are to look to Christ and his example of suffering. Look at Mordecai himself. Let's flip to chapter 4 of Esther, verses 1 through 3. And here we read this. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, in other words, he's found out that Haman is now out to kill him and all of his people, he tore his robes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province in which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. See, what Mordecai does is, instead of saying, I've got to take matters into my own hands and I got to wreck this guy, instead what he says is, I got to look to God. I got to trust God. I'm going to let him fight my battles. I'm going to let him take care of who I am. The amazing thing is later on, God so turns the situation around that Haman himself is actually having to put Mordecai on a horse. Remember that part of the story? Puts him on the horse, puts him in the king's robe, and puts a crown on his head and all kinds of fun stuff, and has to parade him through town at the front of this donkey like he's the lowest slave, saying, thus is done to the man whom the king wants to honor. Now here's a golden opportunity for Mordecai, isn't it? Look at you. I've got you, and maybe I'll push this horse into you a little bit, those kinds of things. He didn't do any of that. And as soon as the ride was over, instead of taunting Haman, he goes right back to what he had been doing, praying. You see, what matters really when it comes down to it is how we see ourselves defined by God. One of the things that Scripture does frequently inside of it is it gives us new labels to give to ourselves. And so one of the things that needs to happen when we're feeling badly, when others have tried to make us feel badly about who we are with the bad labels they give us. And that's what human beings do. They label us in order to make us feel bad about ourselves. And we label ourselves sometimes too. Sometimes those labels come because of the foolish things we've done in our history. Sometimes they come from our history and we can't get them out of our heads. So what does God do? He gives us a ton of labels inside here and invites us to redefine ourselves based on these labels. How about redeemed? You've been bought. The price. Jesus Christ. You want to think about how much you're worth to the Father? Think about Jesus Christ stretched out on the cross. That's how much you were worth. You're redeemed. You belong to Him. How about His servants? Back in that culture, if you were the slave of a king, that was high honor. You're the slave of the King of the universe. You're a servant. You have value. You have worth. He has a plan for you. He wants to use you in wonderful ways. Here's a biggie. Priests. That's what Peter tells us. You are all, if you've trusted Jesus to save you from your sins, you're priests of the Most High God. How about kings? Oh, I'm not feeling like a king. You know what? Sometimes you have to wait to come into your rule, right? And that will come. But nonetheless, you are kings. How about this one? His kids. Guys, your sons. Ladies, your daughters of the Most High God. And He gives you a label that you can use to talk to Him. Abba. So when those labels come back, when people use labels on you, it says you're worthless, you're a lowlife, you're stupid, you're dumb, you're lazy. When those labels come back to haunt you, you respond back with, but I'm redeemed. I'm a servant of the Most High God. I belong. I am His kid. I'm a God kid. Here's a couple of verses of Scripture. We're going to go to Ephesians chapter 5. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly beloved children, and live a life of love. Do you see how he uses that? He takes the label and he says, because this label is true, here's how your behavior should be. When someone gives you provocation, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love. When someone cuts you off in traffic, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love. When someone eggs your house, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love. When someone calls you stupid, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. You're a child of God. Respond with love. Matthew 5:44. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Oh, there should be one more verse there because it talks about the fact that you're a child of the King. Go to verse 48. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And the idea of perfection does not have to do with sinless perfection. It has to do with the idea of be grown up and mature. Grow up, he says, and be like your Father. Even on those who try and pour out wrong upon you, they did the same thing to the Father. They deny him. But even you, God is telling us today, that when people talk to us that way and mistreat us, we are to be good to them. If you define yourself by God and see yourself with reference to what he has done, it will enable you to live and operate in a Christ-like fashion. I had a phone call this week, and we'll wrap with this. Actually, 2 weeks ago. And the phone call was from a particular individual who I'd been doing some ministry to several years ago, trying to encourage her to be a part of our church and things like that. And she was making choices that were wrong choices. And I told her, well, here at our church, we preach the Bible is true, and the Bible teaches that the choices you're making are wrong. And she said, I know that, but I want the Bible. So we taught her. After a period of time, we went our separate ways. And since then, she's gone and become a part of a fellowship in Lansing called the Unity Christian Church, which is an extremely liberal church. And they've been teaching her other different things. One of the things that they have taught her is that if I forgive myself, then I can forgive others. So I sat there, And so she kept on going and talking about this and hemming and hawing, and I knew what she was doing is coming around to the idea that she was going to tell me that she forgave me for telling her that her choices were wrong. That's what she was going to do. But I headed her off. I said, well, see, I'm going to disagree with that. What we believe here at this church is that Christ forgives us. And because I am forgiven by Christ, that enables me to forgive myself and enables me to forgive you. It's not a progression from I forgive myself, then I forgive you. No, it's Christ forgives me so I can forgive others and I can forgive myself. So right now today, are you forgiven? Are you redeemed? Are you a child of God? Then that means, guess what? If you've been forgiven and redeemed, guess what? That means you have to go and forgive others. As you have become a recipient of his mercy and grace, so you too are to be bearers of mercy and grace to others, but also to yourself. I'd like to offer an opportunity right here. Maybe there's someone who is here today, right now, who has not trusted Jesus as their Savior. Jesus offers